Hello, everyone. Jamie here. Today on Thrive with R3, we're tackling a tough but critical topic: the impact of domestic violence or power and control in the workplace. Did you know it accounts for 27% of workplace violence incidents, and nearly 1 in 5 companies have faced it just this past year? We'll explore the scope of this issue and discuss how workplaces can play a role in supporting affected employees. Join us for this important conversation.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for this episode of Thrive with R3. I am your host, Dr. George Vergolias, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jamie Gassmann.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode.
We are excited to have with us on the show today Dr. Sheela Reddy. Dr. Reddy is an integrative mental health and coaching consultant for R3 Continuum and is a member of our Leadership Support and Solutions Network panel. Welcome to Thrive with R3, Dr. Reddy.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. I guess to start, can you just tell the audience a little bit about your background and some of your specialty?
Well, I am a counseling psychologist. I specialize in trauma and domestic violence. And I have had a lot of professionals who have come in with my domestic violence work. I used to be the clinical director of a domestic violence center. And then I also ran an organization with my ex-husband, an IT company. And so between the organizational and the domestic violence work, I also see that there's a lot of professionals who have, I want to really coin the term mind health. So I'm working in mind health. I'm also a certified international ICF certified coach for executives. So combining my trauma, domestic violence background with the coaching part has been an exciting journey for me. And that's where I am today.
And what an important need. You know, it's interesting. My background as a forensic psychologist and also a certified threat manager. I'm often being called into the workplace to deal with people that are on the abuser side or the threatener side of it. I don't work, for years I haven't at least worked as much as folks that are on the victim side. And marrying that, to use that term, into the workplace is such an important area because we see that plenty. So we know that obviously domestic violence and dealing with anger and conflict in the workplace is a passion and a specialty of yours. Can you share a story or experience that really anchored your commitment to that work?
I think there's two stories, but I'll try to tell them quickly. My first job, I was only 21 years old. I had a boss of a different race. And there was this sort of power dynamic where I was subtly told I wasn't good enough. I didn't know enough. There was touching. And then over time, it just felt very uncomfortable for me. And I think I kind of blew up. You know, I wasn't like yelling, but then one day I was just like, I think this is sexual harassment. You need to stop touching me because I just didn't know how to handle it. My another job, it was in a trauma-centered place. And what I didn't it makes sense. Trauma attracts trauma people, right? So one of my colleagues didn't like the fact that I had a happy energy and said something really mean to me. And it was not appropriate. And there was also underperformance. So when I brought it up to the colleague who was my report, it became a big issue with the senior management. And then there was a lot of rumors spread about me, racial stuff that happened. And the person started bringing a tape recorder into the sessions. So it was very threatening. And at the same time, I was going through a very unhealthy marriage and trying to get out. So I just remember that feeling of complete helplessness and painfulness. I was somehow empowered because it was a nonprofit job. I wasn't making that much money. So I left. I said, it's not worth my time if I'm being treated inappropriately. I was the first PhD level student they had ever had. Not student, at the director level. They had never been able to afford a doctoral student. So that was my experience. And I took with it and I said, this is what I want to do. I really want to help people empower themselves.
Along your journey, as you've kind of found this passion and you've worked with other people, what are some of the unique challenges that you've encountered in addressing domestic violence or power and control issues within an organizational setting, both as a coach and as a consultant?
I think when there's somebody in a high level of power bringing in income, that becomes the hardest person to coach, because also the organization wants to keep the person, so people are tiptoeing around the issue, right? So that's a big problem when there's a senior leader with an emotional intelligence issue. The second part is people run away, right? Because if it's painful and they're being bullied, they just leave the organization. So there's black and white thinking, and that's hard to break. People's egos are always in play. I'm very careful. I've done this work long enough. It's really important to protect a person. And I say ego is the sense of self esteem. You know, it's like you're not a bad person, but there's these behaviors that just need to change for you. And when you're able, I mean, so the difficult part is the organization agreeing that this person needs to be coached, and a lot of people making excuses. And I'm sure George is familiar with some of this.
And I wonder for the audience, when we think of domestic violence, we think of it, I think, more in kind of that household setting, at home, and then it filters over into work. And I know we've got some questions that touch on that. In terms of like that power and control, kind of almost domestic violence in the workplace, can you kind of share a few examples of how that shows up? What would be some of the settings? I know you touched a little bit on like sexual harassment, but, and maybe you've got a really, manipulative or controlling boss, but like, can you talk a little bit about some of the examples just to help the audience to kind of relate to the topic?
So when you think about power and control, you don't call it domestic violence in the workplace. We see power and control. You hear about toxic workplaces, right? And the toxic part is just maybe one or two people, and then there's a trickle down effect. And the toxicity can be as bad or whatever as somebody just being yelled at. Um, you know, uh, a boss like banging your hand on the table. It's a very, sometimes it's very subtle behaviors. It's like, oh, well, you didn't do that well, or oh, she does that all the time. It's not a big deal. Oh, he's just stupid. You just let go of it. It's very like under, and it's passed off, and so you don't realize that there's a buildup of that, right? And it's not necessarily, like, again, big behaviors. It's the subtleness of the behavior, and it just turns out to be a look in the eye. I like to use stories. So my daughter says, she says, Mom, you don't even need to raise your voice. The moment your eyes get, narrow, I know I'm in trouble. And I don't yell. So it's just, by the time they were 5, they knew what was right, what was wrong. So it's not abuse, but people are tuned. They get tuned very quickly. So, and then if you have, and I know you're going to ask this question later, but it just seems to flow. Then if you've had these traumas coming in from childhood, and then your family and your relationships, or your intimate partner, you're coming in vulnerable. So the interesting thing I've seen in my career is that when someone is in power and is the person who has the anger problem or the irritability, they're also the highly intelligent people. I put them in 3 categories, can figure out who the vulnerable people are. It's not, it's quite kind of interesting. They will not go after somebody who is empowered.
There's this amazing attuneness of the narcissist, and I'm not saying it's all narcissism, but we know there's a big overlap, right? Um, Between the narcissist and them finding someone that they can victimize and feeling that they can victimize. And I'm glad you kind of flagged that, as well as flagging the subtlety in which that can appear initially, right? Um, so what I'm wondering is, from the perspective of the person that might be in the abusive situation or on the receiving end of
Mhm.
that kind of hostility, right? Or overt violence. What are some of the signs that you might look for early on that you have a coworker that might be struggling?
I think one sign you'll see is drop in performance. Somebody who was performing well is actually not performing well, right? Um, they come in with lackluster because as time goes on, you're just getting worn down. You're not as passionate about coming in. Fatigue, headaches. People somatize this stuff. Migraines. I mean, I used to get migraines, so it was like you don't sleep well, right? You don't eat well, and then you're going to get a headache. It's like the body will react to all of this. They're triggered much easier. Like something else happens, they if say the interaction is between A and C, and then B says something, and C can't really take it out on A, so then they'll be defensive to B. So there's this effect of where that aggression and what's being suppressed will come out in another person. They're like, oh, this person doesn't normally behave this way, but they're doing this way. If it's happening in the house, one things you may see is like their absenteeism. Their children not being picked up by the spouse. They don't have that support, so that might be also there. Of course, the very obvious one is if you see bruises.
If you see some of those signs, even if you see the more direct or I would say extreme signs of bruising and so on, what would your recommendation be of how we broach those topics with the person that's being abused? Because that can be delicate, obviously, right? There's a lot of vulnerability.
Very.
And in my experience working on both sides, although in the last 15 years, I've worked a lot more on the perpetrator side, trying to mitigate the threat or mitigate a risk. But there's also a lot of stigma around being known as I'm a victim, and so these are delicate discussions.
The way I do work is I love. And when I say love, it's really coming in with that. The person who's talking to somebody who's been hurt has to have enough emotional intelligence to approach it, to have built that relationship with that person. And you go with, I really care about you. I don't need to go into the details, but I'd like to give you some information. The power and control wheel, it's interesting. So many people don't know it. Next week, I'm actually going to make a bunch of videos on it because it's common knowledge to me, but it's not to others. It's the isolation. So when there's this going on, typically it may just be that this is your secondhand person and the rest of the team doesn't know this is happening. It's just like how it happens in the household between husband and wife. It can be between a boss and just one of their reports, right? So everybody else doesn't really know what's going on. R3 does a good job. I think because they know I've been getting clients like this and it's been a great pleasure. So they come in feeling very disempowered. And as we unravel it, we see these behaviors. And more often than not, they've had similar stuff in their childhood. So they're vulnerable to it. So I think if you approach and say, hey, you're a hard worker, we see this happening, something's going on with you, we really want to support you. R3 has a coaching program, or somebody else can say, here's the coach who we know. Send them to somebody, just say this is where I say, when you use the word mental health, everyone's like, well, I'm not crazy, right? It's all mental health. I really, really am trying to say this is mind health. Your body is broken down when things happen to you, when there's stressors, there's like fragmentation in your brain, you just need a band-aid for that. So who says no to a band-aid? You cut yourself. Let me help get a band-aid on you.
And I love the mind health as a way to kind of change people's perceptions, right? I often talk about how when I do this with large groups that I might train to, that if I'm presenting, I will ask them, if I'm writing a book on physical health, what do you think I'd be writing about? And people say eating well, good nutrition, working out, cardio health, keeping your VO2 max at a good level, all of that, right? And physical illness, and they would say cancer and diabetes. But if I say I'm writing a book on mental health, people jump to the disease. They think I'm writing about depression and anxiety and suicide and substance abuse. And we have to kind of change that lexicon. I'd love to get us back to where mental health is just like physical health. It's about being mentally healthy, but I think we're a long way. So I love the mind health. I'm going to start copying that from you.
So I'm really trying to say mind, because it's the mind, it's a fragmented mind. Most of the people I work with are amazing, hardworking, ethical people who really care about other people's feelings. And because they care so much about other people's feelings, they don't want to hurt it, and they allow themselves to be hurt in the process, right? And so these are the people you want to keep as your employees.
You say mind health, makes me think of heart health. And if you've got a history of heart condition in your family, you should be really looking at how do you heart health techniques and ways to keep yourself healthy in that regard. So I love that terminology too, not to go back to that, but I thought that was just such a great way to put it into kind of almost like everyday terms for everybody and take that stigma off of it. So looking at, the kind of trauma that comes from
Mhm.
domestic violence or anger, how does that affect somebody's emotional and kind of mind health, if you are mental health at work? What do you see when they're coming into your office and they're, or into a counseling session or coaching session and they're navigating those challenges? What does that look like?
In the workplace, you may actually see somebody who's very successful. You know, it's only when other people hear about it, they actually are covering it up, they're suppressing it. If it's happening at home, with there's also, it takes a while for them. You'll see things like they might get overwhelmed. They freeze up in meetings. I'm actually working with somebody, a couple of executives right now. And the what was the issue in the beginning, it seemed like procrastination, it seemed like ADHD. Well, it turns out there's been very deep abuse that hasn't been processed. So there are certain triggers that get the person into a really bad emotional state. So boss talking too fast, making high demands and expectation. The boss is not abusive, but it's triggering this sense of I need to run away. I can't perform. My brain is stuck. I can't give him the answers. I'm not good enough. So it triggers a network. I mean, trauma work is intense because you got to like dig deep to get in the networks of thought processes. Interestingly, you can be somebody who came in with really good confidence into a marriage or into a work setting, and it can get chipped away by somebody, within 6 months, a year of like this sign of subtle like criticism. And and if you're a perfectionist and you want to do well, and the person is telling you you're not good enough, you're going to really take it to heart, and then that becomes a new persona for yourself. It's in the body, right? The helplessness settles in the body. So, and you can have panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and I don't know if you'll see it at work, but that happens to people.
What I'm pleased about is how that you're explaining the reality that people that at the surface level, and even a little deeper than the surface level, feel good, they feel confident, they're good at what they do. And yet deep down, they still can have these experiences, right? I remember hearing years ago, I actually started my own doctoral journey doing trauma work. It was a very niche area. It was with combat war veterans and it was victims of world torture. It was in Chicago. There was a center that was specifically focused on victims from abroad. So really difficult stuff. Um, but what was fascinating is I remember a mentor saying to me that all trauma is like a knife in skin. If you have armadillo skin, the toughest skin in the world, you could have a knife that's sharp enough and with enough force, it's going to cut through that tough skin. And the interplay of how one's resilience at any given moment, and I don't love saying resilience is tough, but it works for the analogy here, and trauma being a blade or a sharpness that's impacting it. The idea that, oh, Steve or Jennifer, they're doing so well, they're on top of their game. You don't know what's going on under the surface. And so I really don't have a question here. I'm just glad that you're flagging that and flagging how the trauma reaction can mirror seemingly other syndromes like anxiety or ADHD.
Well, trauma comes under anxiety.
That's right.
The diagnostic
Right.
thing, right? And 1 in 7 people have generalized anxiety.
Absolutely. Yep.
It makes it easy. I just give anxiety diagnosis to everybody I see.
Yes.
Because it's there.
And that's
this
even
is just a much, much more deeper level of anxiety where, and I guess I'll share something personal. When you're in that kind of trauma place, really bad trauma, you can get suicidal.
Yes.
Because you don't feel like you can get out of there.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a very dark pain to be in.
Yeah.
And then the flip side, there's people who attack people because they don't know any other way to get out.
Right. That's how they manage. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And they were never, or you'll see, and this is what you'll see. This is a flip side. Someone who is abusive will be very, abusive subtly till the point that the other person breaks down and slaps them or breaks something, and then they'll call the police
Right.
and say, look what my partner did.
Yep. Yep.
And the statistics is 25% female versus male and 75% male versus female in terms of domestic violence.
Yep.
I don't know what the statistics are in the workplace, but it's some of this is coming into the workplace.
Yeah. What's interesting is what we know from deaths by workplace violence. So deaths that occur in the workplace that are a result of violence. So violent deaths in the workplace. Almost 40% of deaths when men are in the commission of a robbery, retail robbery, grocery store, gas station late at night, whatever. The same percentage, roughly 40% of women, it's an intimate partner or a past intimate partner that comes to the workplace and desires to harm them. So this idea that employer says, okay, I know that Sarah is dealing with some issues, domestic violence issues, an ugly divorce, whatever, but he's not one of our employees. That's not my concern. Yeah, it is your concern because there's a subset of those offenders, those perpetrators that will seek or try to find, where do people know they can find me? 9 to 5 at work, right? Yeah. Whether that be in my home office or at the actual, main office. And so employers, I think, really do need to be very mindful of that, to your point.
And talking about workplace curiosity, are you seeing more, because with the remote work and the hybrid work, people are not in the office as much. So to your point, George, where people know how to find me in 9 to 5, I'm at work. How are they masking some of this in this remote environment? How is a workplace able to spot that there's a problem? Are there any different signs that show up? I mean, some employers struggle with identifying productivity levels remotely. How would they spot this if somebody's working from their home office all the time?
I think that would be difficult unless there's like sort of ongoing check-in, community mind health days, or I do talks for an hour here and there, and now it's become great because they say you just talk for like 25 minutes and 35 minutes is questions. I'm like, perfect, because then people really start, and it's interactive and people are asking their questions and you give them, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. So that's a forum, the forum to just talk about anxiety. Let's just talk about depression, not necessarily depression, mood. Bringing in those conversations and giving a forum for people may help open that up. It's true. Domestic violence went up, I think, 70-80% during COVID, and it hasn't gone down. I just gave a talk on loneliness. Loneliness still is at 50%.
The tension is there, and I don't think it's gone down since COVID. So I'm not surprised that some of these violent acts, maybe people who maybe wouldn't have acted out violently are now starting to feel so much pressure and so much, stress that's kind of lingering. I'm guessing there's just that heightened state is what's creating that continued rise and not allowing it to release.
I mean, what you're talking about, I had two thoughts when you said that. One, that emotional regulation is not there. Mind health is not there. You are in a remote environment, and I'm very spiritual. You may think you're an introvert and you don't need people, but there is something about being around people and the energy of people that changes mood. So if your mood is changed and you're happier, you're going to not react, you're going to just come with that energy to another person in your home. Young people who've not discovered who they are, what their interests are, and Arthur said me people like this. They were scared to go back because they didn't have to talk. They didn't need to put their face in the camera. And so the anxiety doubled, and it became sort of also social anxiety, performance anxiety, right? If they're with families, then you're going to have more negative interactions. I won't necessarily call it domestic violence, but there's going to be more tension, negative interactions, right? Which then affect how people perform. So we definitely, and the second part, when there is stress, when a person is stressed, they are also more likely to think of it as any past trauma.
Say that again.
So
that's a great point.
When your stress is heightened, your body, the amygdala, right? It goes into this, fight flight mode. And in that fight flight mode, it's the altered perception of reality is one of those
Hmm.
things. In the fight flight mode, it's not looking at this is work stress. I break it down for a bit. Okay, what is stressful? What did your boss say? What did
Yeah.
your teammates say? Okay, this is not your father beating you up. This is not your
Yes.
father telling you you're stupid and you can't do anything right. Because what's happening in that person's brain is this.
Yep. They time travel. I call it, yeah, they time travel. Yes. That's
Yeah,
a
you
great
you
point.
know this.
No, it's a great point though. And I like how you described it though. Like I'm learning, it's amazing how long you could be in the field and you still hear another colleague describe something in a way you're like, oh, that's an interesting way to describe it. And it kind of deepens the learning there.
Absolutely. And but from what the side that you're doing, George, I just use the emotional intelligence circle as my guidepost. It's so easy to talk about it in those terms, right? So I was thinking today as we talked, I put, there's this highly intelligent person with high self-regard, too high of a self-regard, who can manipulate very easily. And that's a person that's hard to work with, and change, I would say. Then there's this sort of the low performer who's very insecure, and then bringing the toxicity. That person, at least somebody can directly work with. And there's a little less of the power part. And then you have a lot of people like right in the middle, right? They're just struggling, either it's somebody who's just not had enough EQ training. And the other thing I told Jamie, like, we needed a whole podcast on this, the effect of autistic spectrum and ADHD, and how that lack of emotional intelligence, empathy, there's so many pieces to that, how it really plays out in stories. And the partner doesn't know this, the diagnosis hasn't been given, and nobody knows why the person's not bad. They themselves are born neurodivergent, and therefore there are these behaviors which to them seems normal because they were black and white thinkers, or they're like, this is how it is. I mean, and you're stupid, the way they come across. But they don't mean to come across. Sometimes they actually don't mean to come across in a negative way. But if the other person is vulnerable, they're going to be hurt. So there's these subtleties that are also there with the emotional intelligence part that can really be addressed on a regular basis in an organization. And I'm sure you know this, but I was looking at a statistic. It's like it costs $12,500 for a toxic employee to get them out in the company, versus actually taking the time to hire a good worker, which is about 4 or 5 grand.
And especially as you start looking at senior managers, right?
Hmm.
Or you look at like even just nurses, the cost to recruit a really good quality nurse because of the competitive nature of that market. And then the burnout rate in which they just say, I'm going to go to another hospital because this is too toxic for me.
Right.
That's way, that you're looking at 100,000 plus. It's crazy.
Oh,
Yeah.
I know. I live in a community of doctors. The
Yeah.
doctors are not going back to work.
Yes, exactly.
Question for you, just talking awareness, kind of looking at the cues. You kind of touch on like when you hire somebody who's got some of those manipulative behaviors that bring that toxicity to work, because of their ability to manipulate, they can manipulate that interview. How do you know that you might be bringing somebody toxic into that work environment that could be creating that violent, that unintended violent or unintended emotionally impactful and traumatic environment? You didn't even realize you had hired that, and it takes, like you said, sometimes it takes a while for it to show up. Is there anything you can do in an interview process to make sure that you're vetting for those types of behaviors?
I think you're vetting for sort of maybe it's a psychological aspect, like you do an EQ assessment, if there's two, and the EQI 2.0 is great. I've been trained in it. I'm a trained trainer. I like the way it's like if you have high self-regard, it's also very interesting, like high self-regard meaning you're like on the other extreme, I'm the best. And then you have like high communication, which is very good interpersonal skills, but then you have impulsive behavior. Now you see the combination of that. It's like, okay, they're great at communication, but they're also very impulsive. And they're also very arrogant. So that combination tells you something. And it gives you all these ideas of how to coach and where the coaching needs to be. And it's a 19-page report. doing EQ assessments, subtle kind of um, putting people in a team in a stressful, they do alternative kind of, interviewing process where they put people in a room and to solve a problem.
So, playing off of that, so let's say you hired somebody not realizing the toxicity, kind of the abusive behavior they were going to bring into the work environment. They're in the work environment. And like, again, they first start out, everything's fantastic. It's just like what
Hmm.
happened, how they were in the interview. And progressively things are getting worse and that toxicity level increases. Is there like a time frame of which there's been damage caused and now like how long that'll take for that workplace to recover?
I think you had talked about what an organization can do, and one is the education piece. Educating people on power and control, how to recognize it. Two, what is good communication, and when you're being hurt, your self-esteem is being hurt. How do you take that to somebody, and work on that? Meaning you're empowering the employee to go and talk to somebody. So there has to be this list of no-nos, right? You cannot bang on a desk, you cannot throw a pencil at somebody. That's like the sort of the more physical stuff. You cannot name call. Like, certain things just need to be set as wrong, and that if it is done, it can be reported. I was also thinking the other side is, if the organizational culture does things as rewarding good behavior. And when I say good behavior, it's like people using the right language. Like, I feel XYZ, and can we do this, and the team does it. And then using those examples as like, that's really good behavior, you get a star. So you're training the leadership also to boost people's confidence, but also create a culture of encouraging positive, assertive behavior. The assertive behavior is a trained skill. I didn't know how to do it. This is why I like teaching it now, because you're either passive, or you're passive aggressive. You subtly do things like, or so you're not in that middle space where you're able to come and say, why am I feeling this way? What do I need to do? How do I communicate it? How do I get my needs met? And if the organization teaches you that you have a language and a way of doing it, even if it's a format. In fact, I just put that up on LinkedIn yesterday. Like, I feel X, and here's the solution, and something to that effect. It's giving people language that they can use to address it. So it's bottom up, right? If versus only looking at it as, how do we stop the person? Because if you have a team that's supporting you, then you're going to be able to stay and make a change.
I love that point about the language, because if we don't have the language to tell our story differently, the story will not change. And the
Hmm.
stories that we're living, whether we're on the kind of abuser or offender side, or whether we're on the side where we've been traumatized or we're feeling a trauma reaction, we have to rewrite those stories. We have to acknowledge them. I'm not saying
Sure.
we brush them under, but I love that notion where teaching people to be assertive and the words and the language is so important. And it's got me thinking. We've talked so far, and I know and we're kind of nearing the end here, but I want to ask this question. And it's been such an kind of organic, natural discussion. I love that. We've talked a lot about people that are acting out or people that are on the receiving side of that.
Hmm.
Why is it important for employers? Like, let's say, okay, the person that was on the receiving side of an abusive situation, they quit. We got the abuser, we fired him. Why is it still important for everyone else to deal with these toxic environments? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, because there's the trickle down effect, right? That what we're talking about is emotions. This sense of
Yes.
helplessness can
Yes.
may have permeated the rest of the people. Um, and okay, so you've taken one weed out, but the root is still there.
Yeah.
It
Right.
may grow again.
Right. I've heard I've heard workers say to me on the threat side of it, where yes, you got rid of that bad guy, that bad person, but you let it go on for a year. So even though you got rid of him, we still don't trust. Has the culture changed? Because you let the weed, you let that grow for a year.
Well, when you said trust, so, and you've done work with veterans, so these are the key things. Safety, trust, self-esteem, vulnerability, right? And intimacy. And when they say intimacy, it's not sexual intimacy. It's knowing that you can connect to people. Attunement changes with trauma. So therefore, the attunement with the organization doesn't change. We don't trust you to keep us safe. At some point, we didn't really get into psychological safety and the diversity part. And just giving talks. I mean, I'm an experiential person. I think the way change can happen is only if people experience emotions to be able to walk in the shoes of a person. I've created a race card game that I want to take to organizations, because you don't know what it is to have multiple layers of non-privilege or to acknowledge the privilege that you have. I tell people, I'm Indian, but I still am very privileged in this country because we have a good stereotype that goes for us. When I'm darker skinned in the summer and my hair is curly, people treat me differently. So I have empathy for what it feels to be a different race. People haven't experienced that. So that safety is not there. And then as an organization, I think, it's like, okay, this happened, we cut the weed, but what is our ongoing policy to create a different environment? And if we're talking about, what can an organization do, you have to do an audit, an audit of what's happening, an audit of what's already in there, and what are these procedures we need to put in place from the policy and procedure level, and then trickle it down for change to happen and for people to feel safe, right?
What do you believe is the single most important thing an employer can do today to make a difference for employees dealing with
Great
domestic
question.
violence and its aftermath? So you listed off a number of things they can do from a policy perspective. We've touched on a number of things from psychological safety, but if there's one thing to get this started today in a workplace,
I would put a big board and say this is not tolerated, like these behaviors. And I'm also somebody who empowers women. So I've written this poem, which I'm not going to read, but it starts with, I am human before woman. I am human before woman. And so as I thought of that question, I'm a person before an employee, and I deserve as much respect and dignity as you do.
And you could say it's so obvious, but I see that so often forgotten, right? In the pursuit of goals and ROI and financial outcomes and fill in the blank. That's powerful.
thank you all for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Thrive with R3.
R3 is a workplace behavioral health pioneer and innovator, providing rapid response and ongoing behavioral health solutions that help people and organizations recover, perform, and thrive in the wake of disruption and stress.
For more episodes, insights, and resources, visit thrivewithr3.com.